Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Rules of Engagement. As always, I'll be your host, Nick, axslav, ranish, to take a look at tactics and strategies using the game of Starcraft 2. Today, we're going to take a look at a couple of games from WCS America Premier League Group C. Of course, first we're going to start off taking a look at that Idra vs. Polt game on Daybreak, looking at his mass hatchery style of ZvT and some cool things about that. Then we're going to take a look at Revival vs. Ghost User in a Nidus Roach Queen ZvZ, and talk about how to play from behind in ZvT in Ghost User vs. Polt. After these three segments, we'll get to the viewer Q&A, so submit any questions you have to me on Twitter at @ISAxslav or in YouTube comments at youtube.com/official MLGSC2 under previous episodes of Rules of Engagement. Of course, don't worry if I don't catch your question for this episode. I'll be able to find it in between episodes and answer it on the end of the next episode, and all those, of course, VODs can be found on the YouTube side as well in case you missed catching live. Anyway, on to our first segment, Mass Hatchery ZvT Idra vs. Polt. We're going to talk about his unique opening that Idra does. Then we're going to talk about defending Terran aggression in the mid-game. Of course, that's something a lot of Zergs have trouble with. And then the Zerg mindset that you should have if you have a strong mid-game, the mindset going into the later parts of the game in order to turn that strong mid-game into a won game. So now we're going to start this replay off pretty early on. One thing I just want to point out is that Idra does use a drone scout. Of course, that's because he's in that section of Zerg players who likes to do a 3 hatchery before pool if it's available. And by available, I mean if the Terran doesn't get gassed early, basically. No threat of Reaper or Helling early on means you can go ahead and get that 3rd hatch before the spawning pool, because you don't need those Queens out or Zergians out to defend super early pressure. One or two Marines walking across the map is not really a big deal. Basically, you just do it if they go command center first, you get that hatchery a little bit faster. And then he gets gassed in spawning pool, and of course that gas is going to be used to get speedings, especially when you take 3 bases. It can be pretty difficult to defend all 3 points without Zergian speed. And then as soon as you get 100 gas, you take all your drones off that gas, get Zergian speed, focus on mineral income. And this is a big part of this build. We're just going to watch it, specifically the production tab in ×8. And we're going to watch it from Idra's viewpoint. So as long as you're pretty confident your opponent's macroing up, they're not going to attack you. Of course, he knows, it was command center first, and an overlord scout's going to find out it was a fast 3rd command center. You want to make almost only drones in that production tab. And now the thing that's interesting about what Idra does here is that he actually gets a 4th hatchery before lair. And in fact, even going forward, he's going to go ahead and get himself a 5th hatchery before lair, and then he starts lair, and then he's actually going to go ahead and get a 6th hatchery. So 6 hatcheries, basically in the production tab are going to be up to 6 hatcheries before his lair is basically even a quarter of the way done. Is a really, really interesting and unique type of opening. Now, of course, his lair is much later than you'd see in a standard Zerg vs. Terran. And the big thing about that is it's going to delay his Baneling Nest timing. Or sorry, his speed Baneling timing. Of course, you can get Baneling Nest, a hatchery tech. And without speed Banelings, it can be very difficult to utilize Banelings off creep against a Terran army with Stim and Medivacs. And of course, at this point in the game, Polt has both those things. He has Stim done, he has Medivacs on the way. So it can be difficult to engage with Banelings. Of course, the advantage is he has 6 hatcheries. So he has tons of larvae at his disposal. I mean, even if you're not perfect with injects, which most of you guys watching the show are probably not perfect with your injects, this is a really good build for you because so much of your larvae is being produced by hatcheries and not by queens. So it's slightly less inject dependent, right? You don't need to be perfect with injects. You can let your queens build up just a little bit of extra energy, and it's still okay, right? Because the main goal here is just getting a ton of speedings. Even without the perfect injects, with 6 hatcheries, it's definitely easy to do. If you have enough speedings, if you can outnumber your opponent's Marines by 2 to 1 or more, then you can often take them on even without having great baiting connections, just by sheer weight of speeding counts, as long as you're also not too far behind in the upgrade tab. So Idra, of course, being very diligent in trying to keep up on upgrades. He's a little behind, but not by that much, so it's not too big of a deal. Now coming forward to this, now we're at that point of the game when, like I said, Terran has Stim, they have Widow Mines, they have Medivacs, and they're starting to put on mid-game aggression, right? And so as Zerg, it's important to kind of know what the Terran's doing so you can develop your philosophy around that. So we're going to take again a look at Idra's point of view. You want to know how many bases the Terran's on, right? So ideally, you can try to keep it on its middle base as well. It's not quite as easy, but Idra's pretty confident Polt's still on 3 bases. And so as a Zerg player, if you know your Terran opponent is on 3 bases, your goal is just to stay up a base, right? As long as your 4th never goes down, you'll be in pretty good shape. You still want to progress up to Hive Tech eventually, but your mid-game goal is to always stay a base up against a Terran. Now, yeah, it's nice to get damage done to do run-bys and stuff, and that's pretty cool. But if you're base up, your priority should be on defense. And on defense, the thing to make sure about is, okay, one, you don't want to overextend. As soon as you go up a ramp, right, that's where you can take a bad engagement. So you see that Idra very, very intelligently backing away. Just trading some units off. Even if the trades aren't perfect, if you're up a base and you don't overextend, you should be okay. As long as you don't let, all your guys die to 1 or 2 Widow Mines. But that usually happens when you overextend. So it's very important not to overextend. The other thing to recognize is if you have a little bit of extra resources, right? Maybe you don't have any larvae right now. Maybe you're closing in on your max. You don't want to spend your last money on units and actually max out because you'd rather save that for infestors or some other unit. Then what you can do is you can use those extra resources on stack defense. So you can see here, Idra, of course, he knows that if his whole army's at the top, his main is vulnerable, so he's going to go ahead and get the Spore Core and the Spine Cores to help cover, at least buy time against drops. If you kill the Medivacs, it's going to delay them. And of course, he had a Spine Core he was just taken out. But get more and more stack defense, especially if you have a very high drone count. Utilize some of those extra resources on some stack defense if you have them. Now, if you don't, then that's a different story. But if you have extra resources, use them on stack defense. Now, every once in a while, you get this opportunity where the Terran is doing their aggression, and you basically route their army, right? From here to here, Terran's been in full retreat. He doesn't have a lot of Widow Mines to back up on. And this is where it's important to recognize when you hold its aggression, right? This is a moment where you basically stopped his army, and you still have a good amount of units left. That means you've held the aggression, and you've probably got at least 30 seconds before Terran can move out again. So if you just talk about, what the Terran's going to be doing on the map at this point, the first thing is think about the Terran perspective and how they want to attack you, right? What the Terran wants to do, at least on Daybreak, it is map dependent, but on Daybreak, you're almost always going to attack along the top path, assuming you're on the left side, you're on the right. You have to flip everything around otherwise. And the reason why I don't want to attack you on the top path is because if their army's there, they can threaten attacks in multiple directions, right? And they can even kind of come down this way. If they're on the bottom path, they can only go up, in one direction and maybe do some drop play as well. But in general, at least with the bulk of their army, they can only attack in a single direction. Now that makes it a lot weaker because they can't do things like go this way, kill a lot of creep tumors over here, and then go attack a different direction while the creeps are seeding, then come back and the creeps are seeded, and they can actually continue to attack. There's a lot of cool things. Or with multiple angles, they can't go this way. See, you have a really good flank set up, and then they can move across the top, and you're forced to basically unset up your flank and come in from a single direction. So Terrans almost always want to attack from the path where they can attack into most angles. And now, if you can break this position, if you as a Zerg player can basically come up and say like, we're gonna push you off this center zone and force the Terran back, then you have to realize, I just broke that attack. He has to go back, remass up, and then maybe 30 seconds to a minute later, he can come back in and start to attack again. But in those 30 seconds to a minute, now I all of a sudden have a chance to do something with my army and not just defend, right? And that's where it's your turn to put together a tactical plan really quickly. And attacking is harder than defending because you have to kind of decide what you want to do. Defending is just like, wherever they go, I'm just going to kill their units, right? Attacking, you have to try to find the most optimal way to attack. And so in Zerg vs. Terran, especially when you have mobile units, it's almost never the most optimal way to just keep charging in and fight them straight up. It's almost never the right answer. Especially considering that you're a base up, you're actually working on 2 bases up, you're teching a hive. So your goal with your attack is to keep them on defensive and buy time, not to really go after the army so much. So that's where you can say, okay, he always wants to attack over the top. If I have 30 seconds to a minute to start an offense on my own, what I want to do is circle around the bottom and keep him over on the bottom of the map, right? And my rallied units, they can all meet up here, and I can make a second army to help defend that. But what I want to do is keep his primary force over on the bottom of the map, because then, of course, he's much, much further away from that top spot where he can really launch all his invasions. So that's something to keep in mind, but it's a very hard decision to make. The primary thing to keep in mind as a Zerg player, if you ever get that lull moment of 30 seconds to a minute, just be a little bit careful about overextending your army, back up, start some harass, but most importantly, focus on going to hive tech and not losing too many units, because the more units you lose early, the less ultras and infestors and more powerful units you can build. So we're gonna jump back into game here, and at this point, right, Idra, he gets the money signs in his eyes, and he thinks he can take out this army. but it's very hard to run down a Terran army with stim and the speed boost and Medivacs. And it's dangerous to overextend like this. He takes, unfortunately, a little bit of a bad trade there against those Widow Mines. And now, of course, because he took that bad trade, and he didn't put any pressure on the Terran third base, right? I mean, just one Widow Mine here, but you bring in Overseer, you just, send a Zerg or two to kill it. You can really put a lot of pressure on his third base. Because he hasn't been doing that, all of a sudden, Polt's right back in his face, putting on more pressure. Now, of course, Idra's been macroing, pretty well this whole game. In fact, very well. So he's still in good shape, right? He still has a very strong mid game. His Hive Tech is finishing up. He's still going to be up a base because his Polt's taking the 4th. Idra's go ahead and taking his 5th base. So as long as he can defend the 5th base, he'll still be in good shape. He's got a good setup to defend drops, or at least make it more expensive to do that drop play. And Polt doesn't really have the army to take out a base, at least at this moment. Right, so that's what Polt trying to do. He's kind of trying to keep him busy on the top, then do drops in the main. But Idra shouldn't have any problem really defending both angles because this army isn't big enough to be that scary on these attacks across the top. Maybe he can snipe the hatchery. Probably not, though. Speed needs are so fast on green. So going forward here, especially after Idra cleans up this army, we're in a situation now where Idra has that strong... he had a strong mid-game, right? I mean, coming into it, he has all these resources banked up, equal food, but he's really ahead in food if you consider that as soon as his Ultras cannon finishes, there you go. Popped up 30 food. He's got a Hive Tech. He's got 5 bases. His opponent has 4. So he's a base up, and he's on Hive Tech. And, in fact, he's getting a greater Spire to be able to transition potentially to Brood Doors later in the game as well. So he had a very strong mid-game. And as a Zerg player, if you have a strong mid-game, your mindset should pretty much always be, I need to deny the Terran player's 4th base. And the reason why that should be your goal is because, okay, I'm winning, but if we just sit around and split the map, eventually he'll max out and get all his high-tech units. And then it's not that I'm necessarily going to lose the game, but it's going to be basically an even game. And maybe I don't really like playing against, the super high-tech Terran armies. Those are very hard to beat. Why let it get to an even game if you have advantage now? To convert that mid-game advantage into basically one game without having to play an excellent late game as well, all you have to do is keep denying Terran 4th over and over again. And if you have this resource advantage that you got from having a strong mid-game, you can start doing basically throwing units at the Terran player, right? And now you think, okay, I have to kill his 4th base, or I don't have to, but that's how I win the game is by killing the 4th base. What's the most effective way to knock out this 4th base? Well, I mean, you can try to slowly tech the Brood Lords, but they can be kind of slow. And if you stall the game long enough to get to Brood Lords, maybe Tyrion will be able to max out, mount a comeback. Ultralists and Banings are really the 2 most effective ways to quickly kill a planetary fortress. Now, it's not always going to be the most effective, especially if you have a good minefield. And you never want to run Banings through a minefield. You want to hit Banings from an angle where there's no minefield. But even if it's a bad trade, remember, you got 5 bases. If you deny their 4th, this point in the game, their natural and 3rd should mine out very soon. Even if you're not being efficient, you kill the 4th 2-3 times, and then it's pretty much going to eliminate the Terran from the game. So at this moment is where you can decide to win the game if you just be aggressive enough to keep killing that 4th base over and over again. Unfortunately, Idra is playing a little bit passive at this point, so all his extra income, it's not being used to strain the Terran player's defenses. It's just being used to collect more and more and more of a bankroll. And now he is making late game investments, so he will have a stronger late game. But it's better to win the game than it is to go into a late game with a slight advantage, right? I mean, obviously, you'd rather just win the game when you can. So right here is the opportunity where you really just want to be super aggressive and just ultra, Baning, keep running over that Terran 4th base. Now, you have to have a lot of Overseers and good use of fungal growths and speedings to deal with the Widow Mines, but that's just ZvT, right? I mean, that's if you don't want to deal with Widow Mines, you shouldn't even gone to Ultras. You should just play, Infest or Brood Lord every game and then try to deal with the mobility in a different angle. And that's very, very difficult, especially if Terran gets the Raven Satyr. The main idea, though, is you have to deny the Terran 4th base, or else you get in a bad situation. Now, if you don't deny Terran 4th base, you can do what Idra did, where you try to go for the Brood Lord competition. But if you already built Ultralists, Brood Lord Ultralists can be pretty tricky, because Brood Lords have to detonate mines, then you have to send in those Ultralists, right? The 4 or 5 Brood Lords alone are not going to just plow through a Terran base. And of course, if you build Ultralists, you're not going to have a mass Brood Lord army. So the goal here is to say, okay, there's too many mines to plow through with just pure Ultralists. That's a fine decision. It actually wasn't bad for Idra to get a few Brood Lords first. But what you have to do is you have to just detonate those mines, and then you have to use those Ultralists and use the ability that you have this giant bankroll to just grind a Terran down and overwhelm their macro abilities because you have so much money in the bank, right? So right now, this is really what decides the game. With Idra having this many resources, he needs to just kill the planetary, let the stuff die, and remax, kill this planetary, and just keep throwing stuff at the Terran, because the Terran isn't even maxed, and if he loses his 4th base and his top base, he's actually just going to starve out, right? The third natural are pretty much done for. And this would have been a lot easier if he actually started doing this about 3 minutes ago and didn't even let the Terran... I mean, look how much the Terran's mined from this. He's actually mined 2/3 of his middle base as well. And then so for here on, unfortunately, what he does is he just kind of stalls out a bit and decides that he doesn't want to attack here because it might not be cost efficient. And he's right. You know, Terran has a really good setup. All you have to do is kill planetary and run away, and you're just going to starve out the Terran. As soon as you decide to not attack it, now you're in a situation where it's not like you're losing, right? I mean, he did lose this space. He can rebuild it. He's got plenty of money. And he lost this space. He can rebuild it to 600 minerals. He still has a great bankroll. But he at least needs to die this space. It's not that he's losing from this point, but it's going to be a late game where either player can win. So, and unfortunately, Idra does go on to lose this game. But the main important parts of this replay. As a Zerg player, it's almost impossible to over macro. Never worry about building too many drones or too many hatcheries. As long as you know you have enough units to defend them, right? Don't worry about it. If you end up with 110 drones, as long as you realize that and turn 30 of them into stack defense, now all of a sudden you're back to still having a great economy with 80 drones, and you can still have that full 200 food army, and you also are pretty much immune to drops all over the place, so you can even push the stack defense and use it to attack as well. So it's almost impossible to over macro as Zerg. Another important thing is to use speeding counterattacks. Right? Even if your opponent's pressuring you, if you ever get the moment, I mean, the very best players, if you look at the top Koreans, they'll always speed and counterattack even if their opponent's pressuring you. But that can be very hard. So for you guys at home, the moment you hold a Terran attack, right, in the mid game, you push them back, that's when you should start launching your counterattacks. Use that 30 seconds to a minute of peace you have to put them on the defensive, and then your 30 seconds to a minute of peace could be extended to 2 minutes, 3 minutes of peace, and that's long enough to get those infestors and ultras out without any types of problem. And of course, the last thing you want to do is, if you're ahead, don't sit on a max army. If you're maxed out with 200 food, and your opponent's at 150 food, and you sit around doing nothing, all your income, even if you have more income, right, it's all just going to go into the bank. And it's nice to have money in the bank, but your opponent is going to eventually max out, and they're going to start putting money in the bank as well. Now, instead of being 50 food ahead and having a better economy, you're even with food, and you've got some extra money in the bank, but they still have money in the bank, so they can still remax. I mean, maybe if you, after 3-4 max engagements, then your advantage will kick in, but 3-4 max engagements, if you get slaughtered in those engagements, it's not going to matter. So don't sit on a max army if you're ahead in economy. That if you're ahead in economy and you have a max army, you want to keep the engagements going, because you know as long as you trade relatively evenly, you can continually remax better than your opponent can because of your economic advantage. This wraps up the analysis on the Idra vs. Polt game. We'll take a short break and be on to our second segment. Just going to be talking about a Roach Queen Nidasolin in Zerg vs. Zerg.